Hello there, Ian here once again, and it's wonderful to be able to be with you. I hope this is catching you happy, healthy and strong. Today we're talking about long and short-term thinking. Now, my guess is that we all understand the need for both. Long-term thinking is required to track our progress towards our goals and understand the moves that we need to take to get there. Short-term thinking is about solving today's problems now. In my experience, however, one seems to get neglected more than the other one, and that is long-term thinking. If you look at the environment that we're in terms of our biological ecosystem, a lot of the challenges that we're facing now can be traced back to a lack of long-term thinking about the consequences of our actions in the short term many years ago. So long-term thinking tends to get neglected more than short-term. And it's easy to see why, I suppose, because short-term problems are in our faces right now. They demand our attention right now. We don't see often the consequences of our long-term decisions, our long-term plays. We don't see the consequences of that today. Therefore, it tends to get a back seat in our day-to-day operations. However, if we run the clock forward, the future does arrive, and moves that we could have made that we would not have seen the consequences for in the short term, now those same moves become a lot more expensive and a lot more stressful to implement if we want to catch up with a situation that now exists in the future. So hopefully the first idea is not to neglect long-term thinking. So okay, but how do we do it? How do we make sure that we don't neglect long-term thinking from now on? Well, here is the first sort of idea in terms of implementing it. And the first and most simple thing is to schedule it. To schedule a long-term thinking meeting with the key players in the team, the key headlight executives in the team. Don't make it a town hall, a big meeting, because they won't work. For this, we have to narrow it down and look at the leadership team, the headlight team that's going to chart the course over the next few years. So number one is to schedule that meeting. Now, how frequently do you do it? I suggest, at least to begin with, you do it on a weekly basis. Now, I can almost hear people saying, what? Do you know how many meetings we already have? And you're suggesting another one? Well, yes, I am. It doesn't have to be a long meeting. It can be half an hour to an hour maximum, but it can often be done in less time. If you have the right people in the room and you're not distracted by short-term considerations, if you make sure that you're focused, you can have this on a weekly basis, and the payoffs will be large because, as we explained, the future does happen, and you'll be better positioned in the future for when those circumstances arise. So it's in the diary. A long-term thinking meeting once a week. So what do you talk about? You've got the people in the room. How do you set that mini agenda, that mini framework to make sure that you remain focused? Well, I've got three quick ideas. There are other tools that I often use that I'll talk about in maybe future videos. But here are three very quick ideas to get us focused. The first is, how are we doing as a company? Versus our long-term North Star goal, which might be 10 years down the road. If you don't have one of those, I highly recommend that you spend some time thinking, because it gives a long-term direction for the business. So 10 years down the road, how are we tracking towards that goal? And how are we doing towards our first interim milestone, which might be 12 months from now? So not to spend too long on going into detailed KPIs and metrics, but just look at how are we doing? Are we tracking as we think we should be? Number one. Number two, what trends do we see that are going to affect us indirectly or directly moving into the future? And they can come from a number of sources: what you've read, what you're observing from your customers, your competitors, the general media, and of course your employees, your staff. What are you picking up from these sources that tell you about trends that are happening in the future? The nice thing about a weekly pulse is that you set up the framework, you set up your radar, because you know in 7 days' time you're going to have a chat about this. So it sets up something called your reticular activating system in the brain that begins to pick up these trends. So that rhythm and pulse activates your brain and your radar to pick up trends that are going to affect you indirectly or directly in the future. Okay, so the meeting is scheduled. Point number one is, how are we doing? Number two, what trends do we see that are going to affect us? Lastly, okay, what moves do we think we need to start thinking about now to prepare for what those trends are going to bring in the future? These moves don't have to be big projects, big strategic shifts in what we do. To begin with, they may only be small projects, small thinking cells in the company that begin the process of being able to equip ourselves for the consequences of a trend in the future. Because, as we know, if a trend does have a big impact and we have to react a year from now, it's much, much more effective if we're prepared for that consequence well in advance and we are already able to deal with that new environment, and we're well prepared and we're already ahead of the competition. So in summary, long-term thinking does tend to have a bit of a backseat. How do we bring it back on the table and prepare ourselves for the future? Number one is to schedule it, get it on the weekly agenda. Number two, within that meeting, 3 ideas. How are we doing? What trends and changes do we see in the future? And how do we begin to prepare ourselves for that situation that may prevail in the future right now? I really hope that that did make sense. I'd love to hear your feedback and ideas and comments, but for now, here's to your long-term planning, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.